Some people walk into a room believing they own it. The cruelest surprise is discovering they never did. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Windsor Ballroom scattered warm light across polished marble floors as the annual Royal Heritage Gala unfolded beneath a ceiling painted with centuries of history. Waiters in white gloves moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. A string quartet played near the grand staircase. Every corner of the room shimmered with old money, influence, and prestige. Nathan Brooks loved every second of it. Standing near the center of the ballroom, he adjusted the cuff of his tailored tuxedo and smiled as guests greeted him. Beside him stood Sophie Bennett in a striking red gown that seemed designed to attract every eye in the room. She leaned into him as flashes from photographers captured their arrival. Nathan enjoyed the attention. More than that, he enjoyed being seen. Years ago, he had dreamed of entering rooms like this. Now he finally belonged here. Or at least that was what he believed. "This place is incredible," Sophie whispered as she looked around. Nathan smirked. "You should have seen the people who used to tell me I'd never make it here." Sophie laughed softly. "Your ex-wife among them?" Nathan glanced toward the ballroom entrance. For a moment, something unreadable crossed his face before it disappeared beneath confidence. "Evelyn," he said with a dismissive chuckle. "Trust me, she wouldn't last 5 minutes in a room like this." Sophie smiled. "Still thinking about her?" "Not at all." Nathan lifted his glass. "I just find it funny. She always believed character mattered more than status. Turns out status wins." A few nearby guests overheard the comment and exchanged polite smiles. Nathan mistook their silence for agreement. He continued, "Honestly, if Evelyn walked through those doors tonight, security would probably assume she got lost." Sophie laughed louder this time. A couple standing nearby forced a smile. Another guest looked down at his drink. The joke lingered in the air longer than Nathan realized. Across the ballroom, an elderly gentleman paused in the middle of a conversation. His silver hair reflected the chandelier light as he slowly turned his head toward Nathan. Unlike everyone else, he did not smile. He simply watched. Nathan never noticed him. Why would he? The room seemed to be rewarding everything he had become. Wealth, influence, visibility. The very things he once believed would make him happy. Music swelled through the ballroom as more distinguished guests arrived. Conversations shifted toward one topic that seemed to surface again and again. The mysterious guest of honor. The individual whose presence had drawn diplomats, philanthropists, executives, and cultural leaders from across the country. Nobody seemed willing to reveal a name. Sophie noticed it first. "Who exactly are they waiting for?" she asked. Nathan shrugged. "Probably some European royal or billionaire donor. You know them? If they were important enough, I would." The confidence in his voice drew another smile from Sophie. Yet not far away, the elderly gentleman lowered his glass and quietly shook his head. He seemed to know something Nathan did not. The orchestra changed melodies. Staff members began checking their watches. Several influential guests glanced toward the ballroom entrance with growing anticipation. Someone important was coming. Very important. Nathan followed their gaze and grinned. Whatever happened next, he assumed he would be standing on the right side of it. He had no idea that before the night ended, the very room he believed had accepted him would reveal who it truly belonged to. The orchestra continued its elegant melody while conversations drifted beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. But somewhere between the clinking glasses and polished smiles, a memory lingered that Nathan Brooks had spent years trying to bury. Long before he learned how to command attention in rooms filled with influential people, he had been an ambitious young man with a borrowed suit, a used sedan with more than 100,000 miles on the odometer, and dreams far larger than his bank account. Back then, Evelyn Hartwell had been the one person who never laughed at those dreams. In an old photograph tucked away in a forgotten album, Nathan and Evelyn stood on the front porch of a small white house outside Hartford. The paint was beginning to peel. The flower beds were uneven. The porch steps leaned slightly to one side. Yet both of them were smiling as if they owned the world. Evelyn had always possessed that kind of quiet confidence. She never measured success by square footage, luxury brands, or invitations to exclusive events. She measured it by character, by loyalty, by the way someone treated people when nobody important was watching. During those years, Nathan often worked late into the night chasing opportunities. Evelyn stayed beside him through every rejection letter, every failed proposal, and every disappointing meeting. She helped organize his notes. She encouraged him after setbacks. She listened when doubt crept into his voice. When he talked about building something bigger than himself, she believed him before anyone else did. There had been warning signs, of course. Looking back, they seemed obvious. The first time Nathan received attention from powerful investors, he became fascinated by appearances. The first time a luxury watch appeared on his wrist, he spent more time admiring it than celebrating the contract that had paid for it. The first time they attended a high society fundraiser, Evelyn noticed how differently he spoke around wealthy people. Not rude, not arrogant, just eager. Eager to belong, eager to be accepted, eager to sit at tables that had once seemed unreachable. At first, she thought it was harmless ambition. Then the invitations multiplied. The business expanded. New friendships formed. Old values faded. One evening, years ago, Evelyn stood in their kitchen while rain tapped softly against the windows. Nathan had just returned from another networking event. His phone kept lighting up with messages. He barely looked away from the screen. "Do you ever miss how things used to be?" she asked quietly. Nathan glanced up. "What do you mean?" "When we were building a life together instead of chasing one." He smiled politely, but there was distance in his eyes. "This is part of building a life." Evelyn nodded, though something inside her already understood that they were no longer walking the same road. The gap between them widened slowly after that, not through dramatic arguments or explosive moments. It happened through missed dinners, forgotten conversations, and priorities that shifted little by little until one day they no longer recognized the marriage they had built. Years later, standing beneath the chandeliers of the Grand Windsor Ballroom, Nathan remembered none of this. Or perhaps he chose not to. Around him, guests continued discussing the mysterious guest everyone seemed to be waiting for. Across the room, the elderly gentleman still watched in silence. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as if he had seen this story before, as if he already knew how it would end. And somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, a woman whose name Nathan had reduced to a joke was about to walk back into a world that had never truly forgotten her. The atmosphere inside the Grand Windsor Ballroom continued to grow more expectant with every passing minute. Conversations flowed, champagne glasses were refreshed, and the orchestra shifted into a slower, more elegant arrangement. Yet beneath the polished surface of the evening, a strange tension had begun to spread through the room. It was subtle, the kind of feeling that appeared when important people stopped talking about themselves and started waiting for someone else. Nathan Brooks noticed it too. He stood beside Sophie near one of the marble columns overlooking the center of the ballroom. More guests had arrived since their entrance, and many of them carried names that regularly appeared in business magazines and society pages. Yet something seemed different. They were not focused on networking. They were not focused on publicity. Their attention kept drifting toward the grand entrance. Sophie adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and watched another group of distinguished guests arrive. "This mystery guest must be a pretty big deal," she said. Nathan smiled confidently. "Everyone likes a little suspense." "Who do you think it is?" "My guess? European royalty. Maybe a princess. Maybe someone from an old family nobody has heard from in years." Sophie nodded. "That would explain all this excitement." Nathan raised his glass. "Whoever it is, I doubt they are more interesting than the stories people are already telling tonight." Nearby, two executives exchanged a glance. One of them seemed ready to say something before deciding against it. Nathan never noticed. Across the ballroom, event staff moved with increasing urgency. Security personnel quietly adjusted positions near the entrance. Several members of the organizing committee checked their phones and spoke in low voices. The elderly gentleman who had been observing Nathan all evening remained near the staircase. His expression never changed. He simply watched the room unfold with the patience of someone who already knew the ending. Then something unusual happened. A woman in a navy evening gown approached one of the organizers. "Has she arrived yet?" the woman asked. The organizer smiled politely. "Not yet, but we have confirmation she is on her way." "Good," the woman replied. "I would hate for everyone to miss the opportunity to meet her." Nathan overheard the conversation and laughed softly. "They are acting like a head of state is coming." Sophie smiled. "Maybe one is." But as the minutes passed, more clues emerged. Not one person referred to the guest by title. Not one person mentioned a family name. The mystery seemed intentional. carefully protected, as if revealing the identity too early would ruin the entire evening. Nathan found himself becoming increasingly curious. He scanned the ballroom, searching for familiar faces who might know more than they were willing to say. Then he noticed something unexpected. A large framed photograph displayed near the entrance to one of the private galleries. Guests occasionally stopped to admire it before continuing on. Nathan frowned. There was something oddly familiar about it. From a distance, he could not make out every detail, but he could see a woman standing among diplomats, philanthropists, and cultural leaders. The photograph had clearly been taken years earlier. Before he could get a closer look, another guest stepped in front of it. The moment passed. A few feet away, the elderly gentleman finally spoke for the first time all evening, quietly, almost to himself. Funny how often people fail to recognize the most important person in the room. Nathan did not hear him. The orchestra softened. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly. Conversations began fading one by one. Somewhere beyond the massive entrance doors, a motorcade had just arrived. And for the first time that night, the people who truly mattered stopped waiting and started smiling. Outside the Grand Windsor Ballroom, the city lights stretched across the night like scattered diamonds beneath a clear sky. And for a brief moment the story moved away from the guests, the music, and the anticipation gathering inside the gala. Because while hundreds of people waited for a mysterious arrival, very few of them understood what had happened during the years when Evelyn Hartwell seemed to disappear. The truth was far less dramatic than gossip and far more impressive than speculation. After the divorce, there had been no public interviews, no social media battles, and no attempts to defend her reputation. While others expected explanations, Evelyn chose silence. In the beginning, the silence was not easy. There were mornings when she sat alone with a cup of coffee growing cold beside the window of a modest apartment overlooking a busy Connecticut street. There were evenings when the future felt uncertain. The life she once imagined had vanished, replaced by questions with no immediate answers. Yet even then, she never allowed bitterness to become her identity. Instead, she focused on work. Not glamorous work. Not the kind that attracted cameras. She volunteered with local community organizations. She attended fundraising meetings with fewer than 20 people in the room. She listened to struggling families. She learned how charitable foundations operated. She paid attention to details most wealthy donors ignored. Over time, people began noticing something unusual. Evelyn did not chase recognition. She solved problems. When a literacy program lost funding, she found support. When a community center needed renovation, she connected the right people. When a scholarship initiative stalled, she quietly stepped forward and helped rebuild it. One project became 3. 3 became 10. Years passed. Her network expanded. Not through publicity, but through trust. Governors learned her name. Foundation leaders respected her judgment. International organizations sought her advice. Yet despite her growing influence, she remained largely unknown to the public. That was exactly how she preferred it. Meanwhile, the impact of her work continued spreading across cities, states, and eventually countries. By the time major philanthropic institutions began inviting her into leadership roles, Evelyn had already developed a reputation that could not be purchased. She had earned it one relationship at a time, one promise kept at a time, one life improved at a time. Back inside the ballroom, Nathan Brooks knew almost none of this. To him, Evelyn existed only as a chapter he had already closed, a memory attached to an older version of himself. He never imagined that while he had been collecting business cards and climbing social ladders, she had been building something far more durable. Sophie glanced around the ballroom again. "It is strange," she said quietly. "Everyone here seems to know something we do not." Nathan laughed. "That is because people love making themselves feel important." But even he was beginning to notice the difference. Influential guests who normally dominated conversations were checking their watches. Members of prominent families stood near the entrance instead of remaining at their tables. Several distinguished donors had arrived early and stayed waiting. Nobody left. Nobody seemed distracted. It was as if the entire evening revolved around a single person. Near the staircase, the elderly gentleman accepted a glass of water from a server. His eyes drifted toward the entrance once more. This time he smiled. Not because he anticipated a grand introduction. Not because he expected a spectacle. He smiled because he knew something Nathan did not. The woman everyone was waiting for had never needed attention to become powerful. and in a world obsessed with visibility, that made her far more influential than anyone in the room realized. The anticipation inside the Grand Windsor ballroom had transformed into something almost tangible. Conversations no longer flowed freely. They paused. Guests who normally competed for attention seemed content to wait. Even the orchestra appeared to lower its volume, as if respecting an arrival that had not yet happened. Nathan Brooks checked the time on his watch and glanced toward the entrance once again. "This is becoming dramatic," he said with a laugh. Sophie smiled. Maybe that is the point. Around them, several members of the organizing committee moved quickly between tables. Their expressions remained professional, but there was unmistakable excitement behind their composure. One woman carrying a tablet hurried past while speaking quietly into a headset. "Please make sure the gallery entrance is prepared. We have confirmation." Nathan caught only part of the sentence. He barely paid attention until he heard another voice nearby. "Has Ms. Hartwell been informed about the schedule adjustment?" Nathan froze for half a second. The name sounded familiar, not unusual enough to be ignored, yet common enough that it could have belonged to anyone. He turned toward the speakers. Two event coordinators stood near a marble archway reviewing notes. "Yes," one replied. "Ms. Hartwell approved the change personally." Nathan frowned. Sophie noticed immediately. "What is it?" "Nothing. You look surprised." He shrugged. "I thought I heard a name I recognized." "Someone you know?" Nathan took a sip of champagne. "Probably not." The conversation should have ended there. Instead, the name continued appearing throughout the room like a thread woven into an expensive tapestry. A donor discussing seating arrangements mentioned Hartwell. A museum director thanked someone for coordinating with Hartwell. A foundation executive referred to a meeting scheduled with Hartwell the following month. None of them explained who the person was. None of them seemed to think an explanation was necessary. The name carried an effortless familiarity, the kind that existed only when someone had earned universal respect. Sophie tilted her head. "That is the third time I have heard that name." Nathan forced a smile. Coincidence? Yet, something unsettled him. Not because he believed it could be Evelyn. That possibility seemed impossible. The woman he remembered had vanished from his world years ago. The idea that she could somehow be connected to a gathering of this scale felt absurd. Still, the name lingered. Across the ballroom, the elderly gentleman observed the reaction with quiet interest. He noticed the slight tension in Nathan's expression. He noticed the uncertainty Nathan tried to hide. For the first time all evening, the older man appeared amused. Then another small detail changed everything. The large photograph near the gallery entrance that Nathan had noticed earlier became temporarily visible again as guests stepped aside. This time he saw more of it. The woman in the image stood beside diplomats and international leaders. Her face remained partially obscured from his angle, but something about her posture felt strangely familiar. Before he could move closer, applause erupted near the entrance. Not loud applause. Not yet. Just enough to draw attention. Heads turned throughout the ballroom. Conversations stopped completely. Members of the organizing committee straightened their jackets. Security personnel discreetly shifted positions. The orchestra ended its current piece and fell silent. Sophie looked toward the entrance. "I think whoever they have been waiting for is finally here." Nathan followed her gaze. The massive doors remained closed for only a few more seconds. Yet in those brief moments, he could not stop thinking about a single name. Hartwell, a name he had once left behind. A name that somehow seemed to be everywhere tonight. And as the doors slowly began to open, Nathan still believed it was nothing more than a coincidence. The massive doors of the Grand Windsor Ballroom opened with measured elegance, and every conversation in the room dissolved into silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance at once. The orchestra remained still. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the staff seemed to hold their breath. Nathan Brooks stood perfectly still beside Sophie as the first members of the welcoming party entered. Several distinguished guests stepped forward, creating a clear path through the center of the ballroom. Yet no announcement came. No title was spoken. No introduction was made. The suspense only deepened. Then she appeared. Evelyn Hartwell stepped through the doorway wearing a silver evening gown that reflected the chandelier light like moonlight across calm water. There was nothing flashy about her entrance. Nothing theatrical. She did not arrive surrounded by bodyguards or photographers. She simply walked forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had no need to prove she belonged. For a brief moment, Nathan could not process what he was seeing. The years seemed to collapse in front of him. He recognized her immediately, not because she looked the same. She did not. Time had refined her presence. The uncertainty he once remembered was gone. In its place stood a woman completely at ease with herself. Sophie blinked in surprise. "Wait," she said softly. "That is your ex-wife." Nathan forced a laugh. Apparently. Yet the response felt weaker than he intended. Evelyn continued moving through the ballroom. She smiled politely as guests greeted her. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was seeking attention. In fact, she seemed almost unaware of the effect she was having on the room. People stepped aside naturally as she approached. Conversations stopped when she passed. Faces brightened. Several guests nodded respectfully. Nathan noticed all of it. He also noticed something even stranger. Nobody seemed surprised to see her. The people in the room were not reacting as though an unexpected guest had arrived. They were reacting as though someone important had finally come home. Sophie studied Evelyn carefully. "You never told me she looked like that." Nathan frowned. "Like what?" "Confident." The answer irritated him more than he expected. Across the ballroom, Evelyn paused briefly near a display of historical photographs. A museum director greeted her warmly. Moments later, a prominent philanthropist crossed half the room to shake her hand. Then a governor approached. Then another influential guest. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Nobody treated her like an ordinary attendee. Yet, nobody explained why. Nathan searched for a reasonable explanation. Perhaps she had become involved with a charity. Perhaps she knew someone on the organizing committee. Perhaps she was simply reconnecting with old acquaintances. Every theory felt incomplete. The elderly gentleman near the staircase watched the scene unfold with obvious satisfaction. For the first time all evening, he seemed entirely relaxed. He exchanged a brief greeting with Evelyn as she passed. She smiled warmly and touched his arm in a gesture of genuine affection. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it revealed something important. She knew people here. Not casually. Personally. Deeply. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. For reasons he could not explain, the ballroom no longer felt quite the same. The confidence he had carried into the evening had begun to crack around the edges. Sophie noticed it immediately. "Are you all right?" she asked. Nathan looked toward Evelyn once more. She stood beneath the glow of the chandeliers, speaking quietly with several distinguished guests. Calm. Composed. Entirely unbothered by his presence. "Of course," he replied. But even as he said the words, a realization began forming in the back of his mind. The room had changed the moment Evelyn arrived, and whatever secret everyone else seemed to know was getting closer to being revealed. The silence that settled across the Grand Windsor Ballroom felt almost ceremonial. Guests who had spent the evening exchanging introductions and business cards now directed their full attention toward the center of the room. The orchestra remained quiet. The chandeliers cast a warm glow across polished marble floors, and beneath that golden light, Evelyn Hartwell continued speaking calmly with several distinguished guests as though nothing unusual was happening. Yet something unusual was happening. Nathan Brooks could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted again, this time more dramatically than before. A member of the organizing committee stepped onto the raised platform near the ballroom's grand staircase. The simple action immediately captured attention throughout the room. Conversations ended. Glasses lowered. Hundreds of eyes focused forward. Nathan instinctively straightened his posture. Sophie moved closer beside him. "This must be it," she whispered. The organizer adjusted the microphone and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening in support of cultural preservation, education, and international outreach." Polite applause followed. The speaker continued. "Tonight represents more than a celebration. It represents years of partnership, generosity, and vision." Nathan listened casually at first. The words sounded familiar. Standard Gala language. Expected. Predictable. Then the speaker added something unexpected. "Before we continue, there is someone we would like to recognize." The room grew even quieter. Nathan glanced toward Evelyn. She remained composed, completely relaxed. The organizer smiled warmly in her direction. Many of the programs represented here tonight would not exist without the leadership of one extraordinary individual. A ripple of anticipation spread across the audience. Several guests were already smiling. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others looked toward Evelyn with obvious admiration. Nathan felt a faint knot form in his stomach. Sophie noticed it too. "Nathan," she said quietly, "why are they looking at her?" He did not answer. On the platform, the organizer continued. "For years, she has chosen service over recognition, impact over publicity, and generosity over personal attention." More applause followed. This time it was stronger. Nathan watched as several prominent figures nodded in agreement. Governors, foundation directors, international donors, people whose approval carried enormous weight. Then something happened that no one instructed them to do. One by one, guests began rising from their seats. Not because they were told to, not because protocol demanded it. They stood because they wanted to. A businessman near the front stood first, then a philanthropist, then an ambassador, then entire tables followed. Within seconds, the movement spread throughout the ballroom. Hundreds of people rose together. The sound of chairs shifting echoed beneath the chandeliers. Nathan stared in disbelief. Sophie slowly stood almost out of instinct. Around them, everyone was standing. Everyone except Nathan. He remained frozen beside his chair, trying to understand what he was witnessing. The elderly gentleman near the staircase stood too. His eyes briefly met Nathan's. There was no arrogance in his expression, no satisfaction, only quiet understanding. The kind that comes when a truth can no longer be avoided. Evelyn finally looked around the ballroom. Her expression softened slightly as she saw the standing ovation surrounding her. She placed one hand over her heart in a gesture of gratitude. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No performance. Just grace. The applause continued building. Nathan could hear it now from every corner of the room. What shocked him most was not the applause itself. It was the sincerity behind it. These people were not honoring wealth. They were not honoring status. They were honoring her. And for the first time that night, Nathan began to understand that the woman he believed he had left behind had become someone far more important than he had ever imagined. The applause continued for several seconds before gradually settling into silence once again. Yet the atmosphere inside the Grand Windsor Ballroom had changed permanently. The standing ovation was over, but the respect behind it remained visible in every face throughout the room. Nathan Brooks finally rose to his feet, though by then it no longer mattered. The moment had already passed. Around him, guests returned to their seats while keeping their attention fixed on Evelyn Hartwell. Sophie looked from Evelyn to Nathan and back again. Confusion had replaced her earlier confidence. "Who exactly is she?" she asked quietly. Nathan opened his mouth, but found himself without an answer. Because the truth was that he no longer knew. The woman standing beneath the chandeliers was no longer the person he remembered from years ago. On the platform, the organizer smiled warmly. "Many of you know her work," he began. "Even if you do not realize how often her influence has shaped the causes represented here tonight." Several guests nodded immediately. Others smiled knowingly. The organizer continued. "For nearly a decade, she has supported educational initiatives, cultural preservation programs, international scholarship partnerships, and humanitarian projects across multiple countries." A large screen illuminated behind the stage. Images appeared one after another. Schools, museums, community centers, scholarship ceremonies, historical restoration projects. Nathan watched silently as photographs filled the screen. Again and again, Evelyn appeared in the background. Never at the center. Never posing for recognition. Always working. Always listening. Always helping. The organizer allowed the audience a moment to absorb the images before speaking again. What makes her contribution remarkable is not simply the scale of her generosity. It is her insistence on remaining behind the scenes. More photographs appeared. International conferences, meetings with cultural leaders, charity events spanning several continents. The room responded with appreciative applause. Then came the revelation that transformed admiration into awe. Many people referred to tonight as the Royal Heritage Gala, the organizer said. What fewer people know is that this event might not exist today without one individual. The audience grew silent. Nathan felt his pulse quicken. 10 years ago, when funding for this program faced serious uncertainty, one person stepped forward. Not for publicity, not for status, but because she believed preserving history mattered. The organizer looked directly toward Evelyn. Since that year, She has personally guided and supported this event through every challenge and every success. Murmurs spread throughout the ballroom. Even guests who already admired her seemed moved by the announcement. Then came the phrase that would remain with Nathan long after the evening ended. Among our partners, donors, and international advisors, she has earned a title that cannot be purchased and cannot be inherited. The organizer smiled. Many know her as the queen behind the crown. The words echoed through the ballroom. Not an official royal title. Something far rarer. A title earned through trust, influence, and years of service. Applause erupted again, stronger than before. Nathan stared at Evelyn as the realization settled over him. This was the reason everyone knew her name. This was why governors sought her advice. Why philanthropists crossed rooms to greet her. Why influential people spoke about her with respect. She had become the person whose approval carried weight because she had spent years helping others succeed. Sophie looked stunned. "Nathan," she whispered. "Everyone here knows her." But Nathan was no longer listening. Across the ballroom, Evelyn accepted the recognition with the same grace she had shown all evening. No triumphant smile. No arrogance. No attempt to prove anyone wrong. She simply thanked the audience with a small nod. And in that moment, Nathan understood the most painful truth of all. The room had not risen because Evelyn had become important. The room had risen because she had always been extraordinary, and he had been the one who failed to see it. The applause eventually faded, but the feeling it created remained suspended beneath the chandeliers like a final note from the orchestra. Guests throughout the Grand Windsor Ballroom resumed their conversations, yet something had changed in the way they carried themselves around Evelyn Hartwell. People no longer approached her simply with admiration. They approached her with gratitude. Nathan Brooks watched from across the room as one distinguished guest after another stopped to speak with her. Some shared memories. Others thanked her for opportunities she had created years earlier. A few simply shook her hand and smiled. The pattern repeated so consistently that it became impossible to ignore. Sophie stood quietly beside him. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain what to say. Nathan barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on Evelyn. Not because she was commanding attention. Quite the opposite. She never attempted to become the center of the room. The room simply moved around her. After several minutes, Evelyn excused herself from a conversation and began walking toward one of the side galleries overlooking the ballroom. The crowd naturally opened a path for her. Nathan hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, he followed. Sophie remained behind. The gallery was quieter than the ballroom. Historical photographs lined the walls beneath soft lighting. Through the arched windows, the city skyline glowed against the night. Evelyn stopped near a display featuring images from previous gala events. She studied them with a gentle smile. For a moment, she was alone. Nathan approached carefully. "Evelyn." She turned. There was no surprise in her expression. No anger. No discomfort. Only calm recognition. "Nathan," she said politely. Hearing his name spoken so casually felt strangely unsettling. He had expected distance. Perhaps even resentment. Instead, he was greeted with simple courtesy. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was honest. Finally Nathan glanced back toward the ballroom. "I had no idea." Evelyn smiled faintly. "About what?" He laughed quietly, though there was little humor behind it. "About any of this." She followed his gaze toward the crowd. "There is not much to explain." Nathan shook his head. "That is not true." He looked around the gallery. "Everyone here respects you." Evelyn considered the statement for a moment. "I have been fortunate to work with good people." The answer surprised him. It was the kind of response she always would have given. Years had changed her circumstances, but not her character. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly. "I think I spent a long time measuring success the wrong way." Evelyn did not rush to respond. She simply listened, the way she always had. Below them, the ballroom continued sparkling with music and conversation. Finally, she said, "People define success differently." Nathan nodded slowly. He wanted to say more. To apologize. To explain. To revisit years that could never be recovered. Yet standing there, he realized something important. Evelyn was not waiting for any of those things. She did not need closure from him. She had already built a life beyond the chapter they once shared. A member of the organizing committee approached from the ballroom entrance. "Ms. Hartwell, they are ready for you." Evelyn smiled warmly. "Thank you." She turned back to Nathan. "It was good to see you." Then she walked away. No dramatic farewell. No final lesson.